2, 3, 4. Goldenrod and the 4-H stone, the things I brought you when I found out you had cancer of the bone. Your father cried on the telephone, and he drove his car into the Navy Yard just to prove that he was sorry.
Just make sure you talk like into the
Yeah,
I was flathead.
Okay.
Welcome to the live episode of Dialog. Yeah.
We've got this whole thing, this whole preamble, so get ready. Can everybody hear us all right? Yeah. Okay, cool. So, hey everybody, and welcome to this special live episode of Dialog, Brookline High School's student-run LGBTQ current events and discussion podcast. My name is Nick Collins.
My name is Priya Reich.
My name is Max Harris.
My name is Renata Shen.
Also, I just forgot pronouns. My pronouns are she, her, hers.
My pronouns are also she, her, hers.
My pronouns are he, him, his.
And my pronouns are also she, her, hers.
Today, as per usual, we'll be going on for about an hour. We're going to be ending at 4, and within that hour, we're going to have 3 discussion topics, which are normalizing gender and sexuality discussions for kids, how to approach pronouns in school and class, and how we can be patient with older generations. After that, we'll have a Q&A segment where you can all ask us any questions that you want about either the podcast or the queer community or activism. We're all really excited to get this going, and we'd like to thank the Brookline Teen Center and the Yes Fest for hosting us, Wes and his crew for setting us up, and we'd also like to thank Sammy Davies for the live music, and I'd also like to thank all of you for coming today. If you'd like to learn more information, join our mailing list, or even join the Dialog team, you can find us at bhsdialog.com, right down there. On the site, we also showcase queer student art and op-eds, so that's pretty cool, and you should check that out if you're interested. And yeah, Sammy, take it away.
Talk and then it fades into the darkness.
Yeah, we don't, we'll figure out a good way to end that, but thank you, Sammy. Alright, so first discussion topic is, as kids, a lot of us were raised to not really talk about gender and sexuality for a while, and in that way it sort of became a taboo topic because we were too young to be thinking about that kind of stuff. And since we know that shouldn't be the case and we shouldn't approach raising kids like that, what is the importance of discussing such topics with kids? And what would be some better ways to normalize it for children in a non-intrusive way? Because obviously there are some topics we shouldn't discuss with kids that are obviously, too mature for kids. But, what are some good ways to incorporate that with kids?
Well, I think speaking from personal experience, I remember my parents didn't ever bring this up to me when I was a kid. It was something that I had to find out in 7th or 8th grade or some really late date where I wasn't really but before that it was just, we just never had that conversation and it was just never brought up. And since for the first 7 years of my life it was in a really small town kind of scenario, there was a lot of racism and sexism and homophobia there. So it was pretty clear that you weren't going to know about any kind of same-sex relationships. So that was something that kind of then impacted my own journey into men's sexuality, since I didn't really get that kind of information when I was younger.
I definitely relate to that experience. Growing up, even in Brookline, I feel like it wasn't a conversation that my parents ever had with me. It was just something that you didn't talk about. It was something that, this happens, people have different sexualities, but we have no need to discuss this in our household, so why should we even bring it up? It's not like any of us are going to have to encounter or experience this, so why even talk about it? And especially with my grandparents were from North Carolina, and again, it was very taboo. It was, we don't talk about this, there's no need to talk about this, we're going to pretend that it doesn't exist, and yeah. So I think it's just really interesting how personal experience contributes to our personal perception of these issues, because growing up I just didn't ever think about what it was like LGBTQ rights or LGBTQ issues until like 7th or 8th grade.
And I think one of the main arguments that people use against teaching kids about sexuality and gender is that it's kind of an inappropriate topic, and you know, their kids are not thinking about that stuff. But if most people will say stuff like, oh, look, he's going to be a ladies' man when he grows up, or oh, you're going to be popular with all the boys, and that's the same idea. It's still talking about not sexuality directly, but like how, oh, they're assuming that you'll be attracted to these people, and when you on TV, even on little kids shows, there's like relationships and everything. And so I think it's important to start to introduce that there's different types of relationships.
Oh, okay. And yeah, and it's totally, I mean, to change these sorts of approaches in order to reflect our, changing society and just shedding light on new groups, it's a much larger and harder change than people think it would be, especially with, kids shows, especially showing relationships. I mean, it's just such a large change. So much more needs to happen, that it's going to take a long time for kids to really be normalized and to understand that, heterosexuality isn't the only sexuality. And I think even from a young age for me as well, to share another personal story, because I grew up outside of Chicago in sort of like a suburban, rural-ish community, and it just wasn't discussed. It wasn't actively, people didn't speak out against the LGBTQ community, but it just wasn't talked about. So, it just wasn't on our radar, which was interesting. But then as we got older, and I guess politics really started to divide kids. Unfortunately, my first exposure to these sorts of topics was through an incredibly, homophobic, sexist community, and a lot of my friends were very anti-LGBTQ, telling me that gay people made them uncomfortable. And so I think it's also important, along with normalizing kids and how they mature, making sure these sorts of comments don't happen, and not in a censorship sort of way, but just in a decency sort of way, and not making it seem normal to kids to have these sorts of comments float around.
I think it's important because children have they always will have the potential to be kind to people if you show them that those people exist and that you should be kind to them. Children they don't have that much experience in the world, and if the only experience they're going to expose to them for a group of people is saying these people are bad and don't really deserve to have a place in our society, then they're also going to reflect that, since they don't have any other mechanisms to say, wait, that's wrong. So it's important, I think, for kids to especially realize that this is, because they're oftentimes smarter and more perceptive than we give them credit for. They'll notice things if you tell them something and you don't mean it to be bad. You might say don't interact with that person. They're not very nice. Then they're going to take that into heart and remember that, even if they don't remember you actually saying it. They take a lot of their influences from their surroundings, and it's so important to explain to kids that you should be nice to people. That when you don't, then it can really affect how they grow up and talk to the world.
I mean, here we are, maybe 10 years after the experiences that we're all talking about and discussing on a podcast, which just goes to show how much we internalize experiences in our youth, especially about hot topic issues such as LGBTQ rights. And going back to the point about, I think, introducing LGBTQ characters in TV or the mainstream media, I think that's a particularly effective way to show kids that, heterosexuality isn't just entirely the norm. I remember there's a TV show called Good Luck Charlie, and there was one episode where there was two moms, and that made so many headlines. It was look, Good Luck Charlie has two moms. All of a sudden Disney is accepting of all this stuff, and I just thought, wow, this, as a little kid watching this show, I remember thinking, this is what life is like. This is a representation of what I experienced. So to see that sort of normalizes lots of different types of relationships.
But where do we draw the line between that and tokenism, though?
That's
just
true.
that like
Yeah.
one episode. I mean, that's just, I don't know, like that's great and all, and that makes me happy, but it's like one episode in a show with,
Look how diverse we are. Like we
Yeah.
have all these different types of characters. Like
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely understand that as well.
I think a recent thing that I did with these Brookline High School's Gender Sexuality Alliance is we wrote a list of TV shows, books, movies, or other forms of media where we could think of like queer characters being present, and so we filled an entire board with these, and then first I crossed off the shows which didn't have which like killed off their only queer characters, and then the shows. The shows that killed off their queer characters. Then the shows that only had one or one of them in one episode that you could think of, and then we were left with like 12 in the end. Of a board full, which was like probably around 30 or something, it was like cut down by quite a lot. And that really kind of makes you think. And then those shows, oftentimes, like very few of them are mainstream popular television shows that parents would show to children. And it kind of gives a reflection on the fact that if they do have queer characters, it's small, like not many people are access to it, or it's for older audiences. Like, Sense8, for example, it's definitely not for kids. You would not want to have someone small watching that, which also brings up the point of like the over-sexualization of the queer community, and how when they do have like things about it that are not in, that are big things, they're just never made for children, and it gives continuation to the point that people don't think that LGBTQ characters are meant to be on children's television, or that people should know about them.
Yeah, and I think if you have like a niece or a nephew or a child that you know that you want to like introduce to this kind of topics, there are, if you look up In a Heartbeat on YouTube, it's this really cute short, and it's animated, and it's amazing. It uses two queer main characters, and it's adorable, honestly. So I highly recommend it. And there are people that are trying to make small things that are trying to show this in the media, but there definitely should be more. But go check that out. It's really fun. It's like 4 minutes.
That's really interesting. I have a 4-year-old little brother, and my friend and I were babysitting him one day. And he said, "Can I be the daddy and you can be the mommy?" And he was playing with my friend who's a guy, and then my friend was like, "Well, why can't we both be the daddies?" And then my little brother didn't quite understand, and he was like, "No, that's impossible." And he says stuff like that. Other times it's like pink is a girl's color, and part of it is just him being 4 years old and not being able to really process a lot of things, but another part of it is probably internalizing different standards from the television he sees. So I might show him that just to show him.
And it's like, it's none of this is, parents will, like, it's not that they get it from nowhere. It's constantly surrounding them, that this idea of there's only, a girl and boy, and these things are only for girls, and these things are only for boys, and you can't mix them, and that's wrong. And they have this, like, narrative playing up in like for very, very young ages, either on the shows that they do watch, or just for like, kindergarten teachers or something, or parents that don't even mean it as like a proper comment. They just say like, "Oh, you can't like trucks, that's like a boy's toy," and then the kid will be like, "Oh, okay, well I can't play with trucks, even though I like playing with trucks," and then kind of take that in, and it's really like, people don't, I guess, realize what kind of effects it has, and sometimes it's not on purpose. Like, you don't mean to make your kids feel like they can't do what they want to do, but it does still happen, and I think that's it's like good to keep in mind, especially now that I have a 4-year-old sister, and I want to pass on these good messages to her, but it's like, it's not easy to try to convince children that they can like think these things when everything else around them is saying, "Well, don't think those things," because they're not the right way of thinking.
I think that is a really, really good point, especially about being the older sibling or the parent, because a lot of times I think that people in general just make these blanket statements like this is a societal construct and it's something that society teaches us, but at the same time, that definitely most of the time comes from parents, or school as well, but mainly, especially when you're very young, parents and siblings. And I just think it's really, really important for beyond like TV shows and media, just for parents to take this role and tell their kids, yes, there can be two dads, and yes, other sexualities exist, and these things aren't boy or girl things, and that shouldn't be a thing. So before I think we go change things as society, parents and siblings just need to remember that sort of thing.
These microphones need pop filters.
Yeah, that's like my little sister and I, when my little brother was 2 or 3. Whenever he was friends with a girl, we would always like say, "Oh my God, they're dating. They're like 2 years old. They're not really dating, but like we're gonna pretend they are, and they're gonna get married, and it's gonna be really cute." And now looking back on that, I just think it's ridiculously immature. It was ridiculously immature of me and my sister to do, and what kind of impact does that like leave? What kind of effect does that leave on my brother? Like, is he going to think now, because we were like, oh, he's such a ladies' man, he's friends with so many girls, like, is he going to think that's the only way to go? And I worry about that sometimes. And I try to be more conscious of that, as Nick was mentioning before, but it's sometimes still hard because you get caught up in different sibling dynamics.
I think that actually wraps this segment up time-wise. So I think we're going to move on to the next one, because Sammy gives us some smooth piano tunes. No, that's good. Thank you, Sammy. Cool. So, solid discussion. And our second question is one that we've talked about a lot in previous. I don't need this script. This is a question that we've talked a lot about in previous podcasts, pretty extensively. But I think it'd be important to talk about it here, and how, especially the trans climate at Brookline High School, and you know, it's very, very accepting, but there are some issues there that can definitely be worked on and ironed out. Specifically, how we address pronouns in class can be intimidating to trans students. You know, saying your pronouns if they're new, or if they just hadn't heard them, or it's a whole new group of kids, the first day of class can always be a tricky situation. So what do you all think would be some better alternatives to that, and other ways just to make trans kids feel more welcome in the school?
Like, to speak on that, to adjust to using different pronouns was, like, for me, took a little bit, and especially because, again, I was very exposed to the queer community pretty late in terms of my development and outlook on the world, where I already developed opinions and thoughts and like what things should be like. But I mean, like, I did get it eventually, and now it's relatively simple for me to switch over. Okay, this is how I'm thinking about this person now. But I know that's not going to be the case for a lot of people, which is annoying, because it's just like, at some point you just be like, why can't you just understand this and then move on? But for a lot of teachers, I've heard some not say directly, but kind of indicate that there's just so many students this year, and they can't remember it. You can't expect them to remember it, even though it's usually like 1 or 2 students. So like, where I'm going with this, because my mind is going somewhere, is that yes, it does take a little bit, but it's still very, very worth it, because pronouns are super important. Even if you don't think they are, they're going to be to someone.
Yeah, I think when I first started at the high school, and on the first day, everyone introduced their pronouns, and there were some people that I met that had different pronouns than what I would have thought. It did take a little, like, work, you know? Some people, like, oh, I'm never going to remember that, and just kind of gave up. But to those people, they were brave enough to say it, and so I think if someone says that to you, or when they introduce yourself and eventually they say, oh, by the way, here are the pronouns I prefer, I think really take that to heart and really try to work on it. So yes, everyone makes mistakes, of course, like if you might forget, and if they remind you, just remember for next time, because it could mean a lot to them. So something that could be very inconsequential for you, really try, because that could make their day or make it suck, because that's not very nice. So
There's something interesting with pronouns at the high school. So we all go to BHS and Brookline High School, and the teachers are technically supposed to ask all students for their name, pronoun, probably an interesting fact or something on the first day of school. And what I've noticed is that teachers go about that in many, many, many different ways. Some say, oh, just say who you are, what your pronouns are. Some have us write them down. Some forget and then casually bring it up like 2 weeks into school. It happens. So the one concern I have with that system is that it's very inconsistent, and it's not as effective as it would be, I think, in my mind, if it was one unified system of asking students for their pronouns.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, like, as I sort of hinted towards before, it's incredibly, regardless of how teachers approach it, it's incredibly nerve-wracking to use, for my personal example, to use she, her, hers and not look like how someone would assume someone using she, her, hers would look. Presenting very masculine just to most people just doesn't match up for them. And so that's really intimidating. And like, on the first day of school this year, I think I was like, they, them, theirs to 3 classes, he, him, his to 1, and then she, her, hers to 2, just depending on how comfortable I was in that class. And that's totally, I think, an issue. And there's totally better ways you can do it instead of, because I'm like a really timid person usually when I'm like in class and meeting new people. So it's pretty problematic going into a class and seeing all these people and just being incredibly terrified of everything there and having to announce your pronouns in front of the entire class. And so I think, I mean, my old high school was really homophobic and like really just a bad community in terms of the queer community. But I do give them credit because one fantastic thing they did, which is the high school in Illinois, was they had us write down our pronouns and give them a sheet, and then they just incorporate it into class. And so other students would hear that, not comment, but just hear the teacher casually use like she, her, hers, and then the students would start to learn that. And I think that would totally be a way better way, just as an example, to approach the pronoun topic.
It's just like also teachers. Some like I don't really want to name anyone, but like there have been a few high school teachers who have been reported to me by like some students who don't, they either ignore pronouns or don't respect them or use the wrong pronouns when like told like these are not my pronouns, and it's just like. So even as a lot of the time it's presented as, well, you know, the school's making us do this. I don't really want to do this. Like, I'm going to assume that none of you want to do this, so we're just going to like do it because it's required and then never think about it again. And that's like, I've heard people whose teachers have like, or students who completely like ignored it afterwards, and how like hurt that made them feel. And I just, it's really like, I don't know, it very much bothers me to hear that that people aren't really even trying to do that. I don't really know where I'm going to go with this, because I don't know how best way to have a solution, because the way that you mentioned might make other trans kids uncomfortable,
Right.
or other non-binary or gender like fluid people who don't want that as the way to come out. But it's such a tough conversation to have with teachers, especially a lot of those who are either directly or like indirectly transphobic and don't even really want to address that part of them.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, I think there's no one easy answer to this, but I think if there is one consensus somehow magically that the entire trans community of the school came to, I feel like Brookline is definitely, luckily, the type of place where this sort of initiative and reform could be pretty easily and quickly enacted. I mean, especially with asking for pronouns, I interviewed a bunch of teachers for a like side podcast thing. And they said that apparently 2 years ago, or probably like, I think we're part of this, right? The GSA went to, or like put out an announcement about asking for pronouns in classes, right? And maybe you can speak a little bit how they.
I wasn't directly a part of that like team, but I know that who the other people were who were. But it was just basically like going to the teachers, and I think Kate Leslie from the high school is a big part of this, but just explaining like, here are pronouns, here's how you use them, and like it's important, and this is why it's important. But like, I think for people who don't really, you know, if people aren't going to consider it important beforehand, they're probably not going to consider it very important afterwards. If they're that kind of, if they're the person who wouldn't consider it important at all, regardless of what they heard. And it's just,
Well, I think
yeah.
this is a good way to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think if you run into someone that's like not educated on the topic, which is I think one of the more common things that you'll see with teachers, or this is kind of moving into the next thing, but with like older people, like grandparents and stuff, that just don't know what's happening with this because it wasn't really common 20, even 15 years ago to ask for pronouns. And so I think the most important thing is just to like, tell them what it is, and at least your understanding of it, and get them like introduced to the topic so they can start to grasp it and use them for people. So just if you know someone, don't necessarily always think that they're malicious in intent if they use the wrong pronouns. Just try to push them in the right direction on how to use correct pronouns.
And there are often approaches that come across as aggressive. Like I know that when I've had conversations with, actually this ties to another topic, with my grandparents, with my parents, or family friends about these types of issues, it's always more effective if I say, well, you see, and I try to explain it to them in a non-confrontational way. But other times, if they do something and I get really mad about it, like, that's not right, you're being so inconsiderate and homophobic and just all this stuff, it's not as effective because people don't like being attacked when they feel like there's no reason for them to be attacked if they don't know what's going on. So I definitely agree with Max. Also, I think that it's important to consider both legislative change and cultural change with these types of things in school because, again, if people aren't accustomed to doing them, it takes a while for people to get used to it and to understand the true importance of it.
Yeah, that's true, but I just want to point out that like these things have been around for centuries. Your parents and grandparents knew about like this, and it's been in culture since like the beginning of human history. We've seen gender fluid people, we've seen like queer people, we've seen all of this before, and it's none of it is really like, maybe it's new mainstream wise, but like there is a certain aura of like pretending that your parents and grandparents don't know about any of this. Like they don't know they're being super racist when they say this certain word, or they don't know they're being like it's just it's been around. There's no denying that people have seen this before. I don't know. It's just like the argument that it was a different time. I'm too old to learn things is kind of bothers me because there isn't really late enough time to unlearn a lot of these things. Like yes, it'll take a lot of time, but conscious effort does play a big role in this. Like you can make sure you use the right pronouns for someone, even if it takes a while. It's like a little effort on your part, and then it makes someone's entire like day. I just I've just heard that argument used too many times, and when I've seen clear evidence that it's not true, like you can like learn behaviors like this, it's just
Yeah, I think being gendered correctly is definitely, I mean, obviously it's not the be-all, end-all, and this is a whole other can of worms about the societal stereotype that trans folks are like overly sensitive about pronouns, which is not always the case, but it's a stereotype that I don't
Are you
like.
assuming my gender?
That joke,
exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
which is stupid, and I really don't like that joke. But I think on the flip side of that, being gendered correctly is like one of the best feelings ever. And to have people, like to hear people actually start to call you by what you want to be called is just, it warms your heart, and it's like one of the things that makes me like the most happy. So I think like besides trying to convince people to respect trans people, just simply showing them how happy it makes them to be gendered correctly is like, I think also a very effective method of change.
I think we might maybe it would be okay moving on to the third.
Yeah, we kind of like segued into the next topic, so we can probably just like keep going. Do you want to do some music? Okay, cool. No?
Also, I say these microphones do need pop filters. Like, lots of sounds.
So yes.
So pop filters.
So the next question was that was just about older generations and where do we draw the line between learning and between being ignorant or offensive. But I think we did hit on that a little bit on how people, if there's a statement of intent, that really helps a lot. And acknowledging, yes, like sure, it was a different time, and sure, you weren't raised this way, but at least trying to learn and admitting that you respect, who the person is and are just trying to learn makes all the difference, I think.
I think
Yeah, I think I actually kind of disagree with you a little bit in that sense. I think that I think we think it's more common now. I mean, I was talking to my grandma, who there were definitely a lot of trans community all throughout the 20th century, but depending on, like, my grandma wasn't in the city, she was kind of in a more rural area, and that wasn't really, it wasn't mainstream, even though now we consider it to be everywhere, it really wasn't. So I think it's really important to, if grandparents say something that is disrespectful, I think it's very important to correct them and to show them why that's incorrect. And then if they keep doing it and are like, oh, I just don't care, whatever, then that would be bad, and I agree that that's not a thing of the. But if they haven't really had that conversation before, they might actually be curious. So I know people, especially in the media, sort of talk about issues like the bathroom issue and everything, but they don't really talk. There's not as much like personal stories about what people actually feel like. So if they have questions, just politely guide them in the right direction and hope that they'll get it. And if they don't, then you can have a more serious conversation about what is considered respectful. But give them a chance to learn about it, because it may be the first time they're really talking about it to someone.
I just want to clarify an earlier point. I didn't mean to say that like pronouns and stuff were commonplace and a lot of language, because that has also evolved with the times. Like a lot of the words and the terms that even what we define as being a part of the LGBTQ community has come on in recent years. But my point is saying like the idea of someone not being straight and the idea of someone not being like the same sex that they were born with, or same gender that they were like born as has been around for a while. It's like if you look at old cultures, it's just like people pretend like this is a recent phenomenon, but it really isn't. And so maybe it wasn't very much mainstream, and maybe a lot of the conversations are mainstream, but like this has been around for a while, and it was systematically and on purpose like hidden and destroyed like a lot of the other things have been in history.
I agree with you, Priya, but again, I think we really have to consider exposure, especially to certain groups of people. Like my grandparents, they grew up in China and Taiwan during the Communist Revolution, and I don't think they had any exposure whatsoever. I mean, I can ask them, but I'm almost 100% sure of just LGBT rights in general. And it was the chaos of their adolescence was, consumed by war. Well, that's kind of an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. Like it's when your entire country is going through extreme turmoil, it's not the first thing that you're going to think about, especially if you were not personally or particularly affected by these issues. And I don't think my grandparents really understood that these people could exist, and it did, even if it had been around for centuries. It's just exposure to, again, it's been systematically oppressed, and you don't hear about it. So for people who don't experience it or don't understand it, maybe they just don't know about it at all.
Yeah, my grandparents were also like my grandparents, my mom's side are from Iran, and they basically lived in constant war since the beginning of their time. My grandfather was born at the beginning of World War II, and so his entire childhood was also consumed. And like my grandmother lost her sister. Like and yes, I see that. It's just it is in a country that is torn by war and by a lot of other things. We are getting quite off the base here, but yes, that's true. My entire point in only saying those things was just to the people that specifically say this is only recent, and like my grandparents have mentioned like they know about it. It's just it's not in their forefront of their mind, and then they end up saying like really bigoted things. And it's not exactly like, I wouldn't say that their intent would be to hurt, because I know my grandparents love me, and like that's not the same thing. And I remember trying to explain to my grandfather that I was bi after my mom kind of outed me a little bit. Was like a hard conversation, because you can't really give words to someone, especially those who believe that they're old, so they have to have the final word and get all the respect. And so they often take people correcting them and saying like, this behavior that you're doing is super harmful, as being like, well, I'm older than you and you're not respecting my authority or my age here, when it's like completely the opposite.
Cool. So I think that's the time-wise the end of the discussion. So, Sam, you want to do some music? Thank you. Awesome. So, all right. Yeah, thank you. Got some snaps. So our last got some waves. Or jazz hands.
Or also the sign language way of clapping.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm not that hip, but our last section is going to be a Q&A, just about like anything. If you have any questions about either the queer community, about activism, about Dialog, the podcast, which our website is right down there, let us know.
Does anyone have any questions?
I guess living and like experiencing high school through the perspective of Brookline and the community that is, in comparison to a lot of places, because obviously like everywhere has a lot of work to do. Like generally, you know, progressive and open-minded. How do you contextualize what's happening at your high school with, you know, other high schools that maybe are super homophobic, but in Massachusetts, or other communities that are going through things that you would like to participate in? Like, I guess, how do you guys like reach out? How do you create context for listeners?
Right, so the question was, how would Dialog reach out within other high schools or do similar movements? So, I mean, I think I can speak to that a little bit. As like I said a little bit before, I grew up in like a, you know, kind of rural suburban community outside of the Chicago area, and I went to a pretty homophobic high school, and there the queer community was super closeted. It was very hush-hush, and their GSA equivalent was more like a support group than anything, and there was no, I recently emailed them about activism I did this summer, which I'll get into in a second, but they were like, we are a support group only, and we don't participate in any of these initiatives, like activism initiatives, but to speak to contextualizing what we're doing in other high schools, that high school, like I said, very homophobic, and I had a very hard time coming out there, and I this feels like bragging. I don't mean it to sound like bragging, I just mean like this is what happened, because other students also helped out with this, but it was like writing an open letter to the principal there and the administration, and outlining reforms we want to see, and there were a lot. And a lot of it just had to do with the social climate of the school. So things like teachers just being more wary of students' comments and making sure they talk about, you know, queer current events more often. Coaches having a higher amount of like intervention with clubs and activities, because that was another big place where I realized there's a lot of homophobia, because it's students who are most of the time independent from their teachers, so they can talk amongst themselves basically like unhindered. Which is always problematic. And then also the school didn't have any queer topics in the health curriculum, so there is a whole movement for that too. And then Day of Dialogue, Day of Recognition kind of thing. So I think that was met with a lot of backlash and a lot of, because I had like a Google form where people could like sign the open letter, and there was a ton of backlash coming through the anonymous form, which was, I shouldn't have made it anonymous, it's kind of stupid, but it really did speak to the harsh community and the harsh climate there. And I think the only way, or not the only way, but one of the only ways to combat these homophobic communities is by this sort of, either I guess biting the bullet or doing sort of indirect reform methods, like I like to Dialog plug again, but through things like Dialog, which is sort of passive grassroots kind of activism, where people are talking about it, but you're not forced to go to it. Like, it's not a mandatory day, because at the old high school we had a mandatory race-related issues, like discussion day, and kids would just not go to school that day because they were upset about it. But if we have, especially in other high schools, a sort of osmosis approach to this kind of thing, and I've said that a lot in the podcast, that's why Prudy is doing that, but I like to say osmosis. But yeah, so I think through just dialogue, through talking, this is how these sort of issues can be fixed.
She also runs the neuroscience club, so she's a huge nerd. I am
Yeah.
too. I'm part of the neuroscience club, but
And Christina.
yeah,
all
Christina's
the
also
neuroscience
part of the
club.
neuroscience club.
But yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
So just to clarify, the Day of Dialogue at our school is a day of LGBTQ-related presentations and assemblies and discussions, and that's at our school. We also have the Day of
Asking for Courage Day.
Asking
is
for
about,
Courage Day, yeah.
It's like we have a few of those. So there is the Students Against Human Trafficking, like they have a whole day something of awareness. The Asking for Courage Day is about race. We have a lot of assemblies with that, and we also have one for gender sexuality, which is the Day of Dialogue, which is oftentimes closely followed by or after the Day of Silence. So the Day of Dialogue is like the full day of assemblies, and the Day of Silence is a like countrywide kind of thing where for an entire day, students can choose to be either silent or like a vocal ally, and in memory of those who could not speak out for themselves. And I think like those it's kind of also those are the days that reveal like who are the people who disagree with this the most, in terms of like just morals standpoint. And it's always a day to look forward to for me, but a kind of a day where I'm like, who am I going to have to realize doesn't just think I'm supposed to be here at all. So
I think we might have to open it up to more questions. So
Yes.
Any more questions?
Yep.
I think it's just like I feel like schools are really prone to just like capitalizing off of the youth voice in their school, especially like young people who are building up their own kind of dialogue and starting up their own communities within the school or outside of school to get like these topics like talked about. And it's like really weird because in that sense they say or claim or think that they're doing something when really they're just letting teens do what they could do outside of the building and just kind of putting their name on it. Like the schools have so much opportunity to get like conversations of like queer people throughout history who have contributed to our country, especially like queer people of color, and like they have the chance to like integrate like queer rights and just like conversation in like their sexual health like categories and stuff, but they choose not to. Like their biggest tool that they could use is education, but they don't use it. So like I guess like my question is just like, how do you feel about that, and how do you feel like schools should like connect to their teachers and really make this like a necessity with like truly representing like every aspect of our country into their curriculum, and that doesn't just include like white men from the Civil War. Like there's way more to that, and like literally like we wouldn't have anything we have now if it weren't for like a majority of the marginalized voices that we like neglect to shed light in what we teach like young.
I mean, I definitely hear you on that, because there's so many frustrations I have with the way this education system is going. Like the textbooks that we use in my AP US history class referred to slaves several times as servants. There is one class that is about queer literature and history, and that's only for a very select number in the SWS, the school within a school, smaller community, that you can't access unless you are in it. Like there is little to no education about strong people of color or queer people or any intersection between the two, and it's just like you don't get to know about these things. Most of the things that I found out about like sex ed and health was through the internet afterwards on my own time, when it's like these are important things that you should be teaching in school. Like they don't. I think I completely, I'm very frustrated, and I know for a fact, because I'm a part of the Day of Dialogue planning meeting, that it's all students. We call the people that come in to talk about it, we set up the times, we talk about, like, we set up what we're going to have the discussions about, who's going to lead it, we have it on, Google Drives and we plan this for months, and it's all the students. I was actually, like, it's just, and the school does do that, where it's just like they give us a space to do that, but it is the students all do this. I'm part of that, and it's just like that's my thoughts, is frustration, and I want to do so much, and I want to explain and bring up so much about my life and the people who came before me and all of these movements, but I don't really get a chance to, especially because like these conversations are just not. We have them, but not really. They're also kind of forced on the students afterwards, because the teachers are like, let's just have this conversation one class time, and we're never going to talk about it again.
Yeah, and I think in schools it's really important to talk to your teachers about this, and if teachers, I think, are more open-minded than we think sometimes. I mean, definitely not other times. It depends on the teacher. But if you're doing a unit or a period of time, and you're like, hey, there was a big, like, the Stonewall riots happened right in this time that we're studying, and you go up to them and actually try to talk to them about it and show them why it's important to talk about these things, I think teachers will slowly start to rethink about this. I think they're going based off of textbooks that, like you said, are written by old white men. And so it's hard to stray away from that, but the more kids that tell them to, the more they're gonna, I think the more they'll try. And I mean, of course, during this political climate and with the current like educational leader, Betsy DeVos, like institutionalized change in curriculum is not coming for the next 4 years. But after that, I think once, hopefully, someone a little more progressive comes into the Department of Education, they'll start to see, oh, look at these programs that have been working in the time when they weren't even sponsored by the government. Maybe the government will start to put these new programs in place. And so I think part of it's waiting a little bit, but most of it is trying to just appeal to individual teachers or go to your principal, like you said, and say, look, we're doing this after school, but we want school funding. This is not fair. Other clubs get this, and we're the same. And so I think that's an important element to it.
I had, just sorry, I just quickly want to add this. I had an experience in, I believe, 8th grade. We were learning World War II, and we spent a lot of time discussing the Holocaust, and trigger warning, guys, sorry that came too late, but just general World War II war crimes in Europe, but we didn't spend any time discussing war crimes in the Pacific Theater, and that really bothered me because I was like, this is not okay. Why are we ignoring all this terrible stuff that happened if we're acknowledging some other stuff that happened in another part of the world? So I had a conversation with my teacher, and he was like, I understand that. There are certain things that we can teach them. We can teach, and we can teach, and we are not allowed to teach. And that was just an interesting way that I got to interact with my teacher and discuss the curriculum in depth and make real change.
I know personally, I did learn about the war crimes when I was what year, sophomore or junior?
Oh, this is in 8th grade.
Oh yeah, but I remember there was like learning about that, so it's not saying they couldn't teach it. It's just that it's just like it's just there also then people don't get to learn about. Like I see a lot of, especially white gay men who are things like the queer community has a lot of ingrained in institutional racism within it. It's really frustrating, and it's also like Stonewall rights were like pushed by black trans women. Like you have to know if you want to like say like, oh yeah, there's like the whole Black Gays for Trump thing that happened a while ago, and it's just that they are also benefiting off so much privilege of just being white men that it's just you are completely forgetting exactly why you are here and why your liberation is, because it's bounded to these people that you're pushing under the rug. Sorry.
This is just a comment, but I feel like honestly, like the platform that you guys have created places you in a position of truly being an educator. Like I feel in education, like there's no place for teens other than being considered the students. But like as you can clearly see, there's so much knowledge and like experience and open-mindedness that you guys have that puts you in a position where you can teach people things. You can teach teachers things. And I feel like that's completely disregarded. And like teachers think like, well, I'm the teacher, you're young, you know less, therefore you're the student. But like at like the point that you are now, and considering like anybody here, like yes, Miss in general, like we all have the opportunity to educate other people, and I feel like you guys are doing just that. You give you props for being awesome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I think that is about all our time, unless there's like one 1-minute question. Like really, is this really short?
It's pretty good, yeah.
Okay.
So have you ever seen, like, at least in VHS, have you ever seen someone that has been like confronted by a teacher, like the teacher would say like, oh, you're dressing inappropriately for the way you look, or just like judging by like their appearance?
I haven't been here for that long, so I don't really. I think you all can maybe speak to that a bit better.
Is your question specifically referring to like, for example, trans people who might not fit with their like preferred pronouns and gender, or like are you talking about other things like dress coding?
I'd say more trans.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm guessing that probably has happened. I know that there are stories of people who have faced disrespect by teachers, and oftentimes, like, it's not said. A lot of the times where people know how that you don't think that you don't respect them. It's a lot of human communication is nonverbal. And although I haven't personally heard specific stories, but like about this, though there was an event a few years ago where on the gender neutral bathrooms, someone placed a sticker on there saying woman or man or something, and on the female bathroom, which was next to it, placed woman. So it's just where, it's just this stuff. Although it is a very liberal school and things like that aren't obvious and clear. Like there's no one there, there's no one who is going to yell any slurs at any person in the hallways, because that's not the kind of homophobia and racism that happens. It's very kind of underlying. It's how you talk about it, how you make, oh, that's some gay jokes. It's how it's very slight, like under the surface, not obvious forms of these kind of repressive behavior. And I think like that's where people mistake it for not existing, is if they can't obviously immediately see it, even though it's still there.
So I think that actually wraps up the episode. So thank you everybody for coming. And I'd like to thank Wes, the Yes Fest, and the Teen Center for hosting us, Sammy Davies for providing us with the piano music. And like I said, all of you, thank you for coming, and thank you Max, Priya, and Renata for participating. And if you'd like to learn more about the podcast, once again, join our newsletter, read some cool op-eds, or join. Our URL is right down there, bhsdialog.com, and we also have an Instagram at bhsdialog, Snapchat too, coming soon.
Project Method is on to the gym at 4 o'clock.